Hi, Chris.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Great.
Good?
Really good.
Good.
Yeah.
Let me introduce this. Really good. I mean, you're nodding your head. This isn't perfunctory. You're really good. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Chris Mooney, author of, before this book, The Republican War on Science, and now this book, The Republican Brain, which I got to say I would call a not altogether flattering depiction of the Republican brain. The subtitle is The Science of Why They Deny Science and Reality, they being Republicans. And maybe you're going to tell me it's not an unflattering depiction of the Republican brain, but I imagine you're hearing from some Republicans who are not flattered.
They're not that happy. They don't understand the argument. I don't think they're actually reading it. There are a lot of things out of this research that paint them in a very positive light and paint liberals in a negative light. But one area of clear conservative weakness is about, being willing to accept what the scientific community says. And I do trace that ultimately to personality and ways of thinking.
So their rejection of your book is proof of its thesis.
That's the idea.
That's
yes.
great.
I set a clever trap.
I've always wanted to write a book like that.
Some have sprung it already. Yes.
That was brilliant. You're so much smarter than me.
Sprung the trap in USA Today.
I was just, because Jonah, as you know, author of the book Liberal Fascism, is opposed to the denigration of ideological groups. That's a little joke. Jonah's a friend.
I'm laughing.
But he said about your where I have that. Wait, there's a great quote. Just give me a second. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Jonah writes that your book is self-serving bigotry that allows liberals to justify their own closed-mindedness on the grounds that Republicans aren't even worth listening to.
Well, as I said, I think that there's a lot of good news for conservatives in this field, in the psychology of ideology, and bad news for liberals. So it's kind of about whether you're willing to look at the issue in all of its complexity and all of its facets, which, ironically, I say, liberals being prone to complexity and nuance are more likely to do. I don't think it's good news for conservatives when it comes to how they deal with inconvenient information, how they deal with the kinds of information that's complex and laden with uncertainty of the sort that scientists produce, because I say that is more of a liberal style of thinking. But if you talk about obedience, loyalty, teamwork, courage, all these kinds of things, there's all these great news for conservatives. So, I don't think that it's bigotry to talk about what the research shows in terms of strengths and weaknesses.
I can see how they might take it the wrong way.
I can see that.
But let's go through the argument before we talk about whether how they should take it. So there is, to begin with, well, let's start at the beginning. You're arguing that there are some things that are true of people generally, and here I think you're joined by a lot of psychologists who would say that we practice what's now being called kind of motivated reasoning. That is to say, we all, among other things, go around looking for facts that confirm our pre-existing views, confirmation bias. So no humans are built to be objective truth.
There are no Spocks.
Right.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Okay. So there's that as a start. And then, but I guess you're saying that conservatives, by nature of the kinds of people who become conservatives, right, by nature of the personality type that is drawn to conservatism, are maybe not quite as good at resisting that bias or overcoming the bias as liberals on average?
Mm-hmm. Or not as willing to change over time. And so it could be the case, and I think that this is the view that I probably share with Jonathan Haidt, who has a book out about a similar analysis now, is that, liberals and conservatives both have emotions, all right? And Emotions guide their reasoning. They guide their reasoning in different directions. But nevertheless, I would argue there's personality differences between liberals and conservatives that over time are going to create a natural affinity between liberals and scientists and intellectuals and belief updaters kind of people. That's the contention.
So let's talk about the personality science.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, and I think this is maybe the main part of your argument, that personality psychologists have long studied a dimension of personality that is kind of like openness to new experience, right?
Right.
And I gather that there is a fairly well-established correlation here between ideology, that liberals, that it's not all that controversial at this point, that liberals score more highly on openness to new experience.
Right. Yeah, I don't see how you get around it. I mean, some of the research actually, Alan Gerber and his colleagues at Yale, political scientists, compared the effect of personality on ideology to the effect of education and level of income on ideology, and they did it in a sample of 12,000 people. And it turned out that this openness trait was somewhat more powerful in making you a liberal than education was in making you a liberal, or than income was in making you a conservative. So it's actually quite a big thing. And I was just on Up with Chris Hayes, MSNBC, with Jonathan Haidt, who is seen as someone who's a little bit more centrist on this topic. And he said, yes, absolutely, Chris is right. This is what all the literature on personality says. So he's not arguing with this. I'm not aware of anyone who is arguing with this, who is actually
with that correlation. Now you're taking it further and arguing that it accounts for what you identify as a conservative resistance to certain truths. For example, global warming, climate science would be a big one for you. What are the other ones? Well, evolution.
Evolution, absolutely. Because, I mean, the opposite of openness, right? Openness involves a cognitive style, that is more tolerant of uncertainty, ambiguity, nuance, change. And so openness is all important in explaining the difference between left and right. If you explain the difference between left and right as being about stability versus change, which is one of the most universal definitions of it, then you can see how that would be rooted in a more open versus a less open personality. So science is naturally appealing to the kinds of people who are okay with uncertainty, okay with ambiguity, like to explore new ideas, and conservatism, more people who are looking for certainty, looking for fixed answers, looking for fixed beliefs, not really so tolerant of ambiguity.
Okay.
Now, of course, this is all averages, by the way, right? I mean, you're gonna have closed liberals, you're gonna have open conservatives. It's just gonna be less common on average. I mean, that's very important to say.
Okay. Let's. And I mean, what have I said to that? That well, you've almost you're just almost playing on the definition of conservatism. I mean, Burkean conservatism is almost defined as a resistance to change by Burke. I mean, right?
Sure.
It's like it's a suspicion of the new, and there's a logic behind that. I think that the new is untested. That our old ways of doing things are based on accumulated wisdom and so on. But I mean, so there's a certain kind of conservatism that almost defines itself as being suspicious of the new.
Fair enough. But isn't it revealing that now modern science is saying that this is something that is rooted in people's personality, that is actually probably reflected also in their physiology? In terms of more exploratory and less exploratory approaches to the world, which we're now measuring with eye tracker devices. What a liberal and conservative eyes dart to automatically when you show them a collage, and it turns out that conservatives are looking at more scary images.
Okay, let's talk about some of that science. And first, we should say that the question of how much of any difference in traits, if any, is genetic, and how much is environmental in origin is kind of a separate question.
Sure, fair enough.
And I would say that even when a trait is known to, in some sense, have a genetic basis, that doesn't mean that in the case of any two particular groups, any of the differences. Okay? This is a separate and complex question. And that
we should talk about that maybe, because there is genetic research, but yes.
Yeah, in general, between the average two people, differences in personality tend to have some degree of genetic explanation,
Absolutely.
they think. But that doesn't mean that any two people or any two groups selected, the differences will be accounted for by genetics. And anyway, and I guess that accounts even for actual physiological differences. I mean, let's talk about one of the more striking things you say, which is that if you look at actual brain structures, like the amygdala, which is very much about emotion, and then something in the frontal lobes, what is it? The
anterior cingulate cortex.
The anterior, cingulated cortex, which has more to do with reasoning and deciding among different things. Well, what is the finding there? And how solid?
Well, I mean, this is the most new and controversial science, right? And it's important to say that the reason that scientists went looking in the brain for liberal conservative differences was because the personality differences have been studied so much,
right?
That they were looking for the physical correlates of that. And we don't have a ton of brain studies. We've got less than 10, I would say, that are doing this kind of stuff. At least that I report on in the book. Maybe there's others I missed, but I think I was trying to be pretty comprehensive in searching for them all. In one study, there's a little bit more gray matter in the right amygdala in British conservatives. This is only British. But it fits the theory. I mean, and I'm not saying that it wouldn't work in the U.S. I just don't see the study in the U.S. And so the amygdala is, the brain's automatic fear and threat center. Keeps you alive. It's great that you have one. Other animals have one too, right? You can imagine why evolution would build such a thing. Then the anterior cingulate. In that same study, liberals had a little more gray matter in the anterior cingulate. In another study, that's a classic test for use of the anterior cingulate, where basically you're seeing letters on a screen and you have to push a button every time you see an M, but then you have to stop every time you see a W, and you have to do that really fast. The anterior cingulate is thought to be involved in this error detection that makes you stop a habitual pattern of behavior. That's why they did that test. So liberals did better on the test, showed more anterior cingulate activity when doing the test. So this fits the story that psychology is telling, which is why people were doing this kind of research in the first place.
Okay. Yeah. And then there's the well-known the finding that created first of all, the amygdala thing, that's not like established science, right? I mean, there are not enough studies that have been done to just assert that as a truth about. Let's talk about the caveats for the amygdala study, for instance. I mean, it fits the theory. It fits the physiological evidence too. If conservative eyes more than liberal eyes are going straight to images of threat, and if conservative skin conductance is higher when looking at images of threat than liberal skin conductance is, activation of the nervous system, that's the kind of things that they're finding. That fits the amygdala theory. That said, what you're looking at is a correlation. It's not a correlation of 1. It's a correlation of 0.23. Okay, so what that means is that, relative larger amygdala is not predicting a conservative in every case or anything close to it. You've got, people talk about the error bars being fairly large in the study. People talk about the amygdala doing more than one thing, which is also true. So what does it mean that the amygdala is doing? And then, of course, there's the causation problem. I mean, chicken and egg problem. I mean, does being conservative grow your amygdala larger, or does having a larger amygdala make you conservative? And the answer there is probably some combination of both. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of uncertainty here. I build the argument on the personality stuff. But I pull in and discuss, because this is all peer-reviewed published research, and it fits the theory, and that's why I discuss it. But I think the personality stuff is really the bedrock. Yeah, and let's talk a little more about the personality stuff. We talked about the openness to novelty dimension, but there's also a connection with heights, the work you mentioned of heights, okay? So he emphasizes, I think, 5 or 6, depending of the version of his theory you're looking at, divides a personality into, like, say, about 5 things. And conservatives, he doesn't divide
It's morality for him.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. These are dimensions of moral decision-making.
Yes.
So things like loyalty, emphasizing authority, he says conservatives are bigger on, whereas things like fairness and protecting, the vulnerable, liberals are bigger on, and you're seeing, and here you build partly on the work of George Lakoff, I guess, but you're seeing a connection between that and what you're calling a kind of a greater conservative resistance to scientific truth.
Yes, sort of. So let's take a step back. What the research is giving us is reliable personality differences between liberals and conservatives and reliable moral differences between liberals and conservatives. And the moral research is Haidt, it's Lakoff. I would say Dan Kahan at Yale is also essentially doing it. And they're finding similar things in terms of conservatives having this morality in this sense is automatic and emotional. And it's about how you feel about situations without even thinking about them. And they're finding conservatives much more, emotionally defending of authority. And liberals much more, an egalitarian narrative makes their emotions fire. Those kinds of things. How that relates to the personality differences in terms of openness versus closeness, both kinds of differences are operating at the same time, and I have not heard from the scientists a completely satisfying account of how they relate to each other. But they travel together, right? So I think that we need more clarity on why we have both personality differences and moral differences traveling together and how they're relating to each other. And I don't think that's scientifically clear yet, but it is. Both are telling a consistent story.
Okay.
Right. So, with that out of the way, where do we then go with it? The moral differences bias you. That's clear. In other words, you see a situation. Let's take vaccination, right? A kid has allegedly been given autism by a vaccine made by a big corporation. The moral differences bias you in the following way. If you're liberal, egalitarian, you suspect big corporations of doing wrong, right? Because you're into equality, and that's a concentration of power. So you're likely, your heart goes out because you think the corporation is oppressing the weak. But then you're also sensitive to harm to a child. So, your heart goes out again emotionally for that reason. So that's the kind of narrative that a liberal feels strongly about. And then you're biased to believe it, is the idea, which is why the left, I would say, is more biased to believe anti-vaccine false claims. That's how morality pushes left and right in different directions. And then personality is more about style of processing. So I guess, yeah.
And you use this vaccine thing as an example of how, in your view, even when the liberal mind kind of naturally leads it in the direction of error or resistance of truth, it recovers more quickly, I think, in your view. And you use this myth about the connection between vaccines and autism as an example where liberals kind of got over that. But, here I wonder how easy it is to compare these different cases. So if you compare that to climate science, like that vaccines and autism is a straightforward correlational question. If it turns out that there's just no correlation, pretty much anybody can understand that. That's totally straightforward, and it's hard to deny. Climate science is more complicated because the argument doesn't end with the fact of rising temperature, right? There are legitimate questions. You can say, but wait a second, what caused it? And then you can get subtler and say, but and maybe the people you're talking about don't do this, but say, well, what about the clouds that'll be generated? Won't that counteract the effect? Yeah. But anyway, in general, I find it hard to compare these case studies, and it seems that gets in the way of some of the experiments as well. But what would you say about that?
Well, there's a lot of problems, actually, with comparing the case studies in a psychological sense. I agree, none of them are exactly the same. What you'll also get a lot of the times is comparing, conservatives, what is their bias on climate, versus liberals, what is their bias on nuclear. And those case studies are very different for another set of reasons. But what's even more fundamental is it's not clear that conservatives have the same strength of emotion about climate denial that liberals have strength of emotion about vaccine denial.
You mean they have more or less?
Well, I don't know. Do they? I mean, it probably varies per person.
Right.
So then, how do you control for that intensity of emotion? So it's very actually difficult to find these perfect case studies to prove one side being more biased than the other. Here I am talking like a liberal and explaining all the nuance. Nevertheless, I do think that there's quite a lot of studies that are capturing quite striking conservative bias in a lot of these cases.
Okay, but nuclear power leads me to another kind of tough one, I think, where the finding wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed to you. And here was where you found, this may have been where you're working with your collaborator in that final chapter.
We ran a study, yeah.
I'm not sure, but it said on the issue of nuclear power, I guess you confronted both conservatives and liberals with pro and opposed arguments on nuclear power. And you found that on nuclear power, the conservatives perceive a bigger difference between the persuasiveness of the pro and the counter arguments, pro and the con arguments. That's what the word I was looking for. Yeah. Then did the liberals. Now, and you take that to mean that the liberals kind of weighed them and said, well, okay, they both have their strong points, and that's like more objective. But of course, it could be that in this particular case, the argument in favor is just much stronger, right?
Well, yes, but in this study we tried to control for that because basically what the liberals and conservatives did was they read a fake argument that we'd made up containing lots of misinformation. we gave them lies. But the lies were either pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear, and, sentence for sentence, paragraph for paragraph, they were pretty close in terms of the same length and the same kind of claims. It would just be sort of the opposite.
Sure, but I don't know how you could keep from maybe making one argument more persuasive than the other. Who's to judge?
Well, fair enough. I mean, you'd have to read our essays. You've got a little clip from the essay in the book. You don't have the whole essay. And we came up with a lot of essays. But there was an attempt to control for length and the kind of argument. It was just flipped. I mean, yeah, this is the uncertainty in science that you're talking about. And this is one study that we did that I think is a drop in the bucket in terms of our total understanding. But I think it is noticeable that on the issue where where allegedly the left hates science, nuclear, we actually got more motivated reasoning among conservatives than liberals in one study. I think that's interesting.
Wait, what do you mean by that? You got more motivated reasoning? Wait, what?
Well, that's what the study was ultimately trying to test. In other words, they would read an essay that either did or didn't support their initially expressed view. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then they were asked, how persuasive is the essay and how much did your views change? Right? And what we found was that in terms of those kinds of ratings, conservatives, liberals were rating things more persuasive that disagreed with them. If I remember the finding, I have to go back and look. And also, we're more willing to change, I believe. But there were two different measures, and basically there were measures of bias after encountering this information. And liberals did better in that test of nuclear. Surprisingly, they did better on nuclear than they did on global warming. So, that itself is interesting, too.
Better is defined how?
Less biased. Less unwilling to change an initial view.
They were more willing to change an initial view in the case of climate science, the liberals.
In the case of nuclear?
In the case of nuclear.
Yeah, because on climate, and again, I'm going to have to go back and read this chapter now, but in climate, I think that they were rating the counterpoint, when they read the counterpoint, they were rating it as persuasive. So they're more open-minded in that sense, but then in terms of changing beliefs after reading a climate denier argument, they weren't changing their beliefs one bit. So.
Okay. I mean, I guess I'm going to harp on this a little, but I'm kind of getting at it. It seems to me almost the inherent difficulty of constructing valid tests in this realm. So
you're not the first.
Right, and I really mean inherent. It's like you've got studies where you say, okay, Fox News listeners denied the truth in a higher percentage of these cases than liberals. But of course, you could, if you wanted, select the truths in a way that guaranteed that. You would just choose truths that you know conservatives disagree with and leave out the truths that you know liberals disagree with, right? And I mean,
I could design a study that made non-Fox viewers seem more wrong just by picking liberal weak spots.
Right, and I mean,
why doesn't Fox do this? it'd be easy to design this study.
Exactly, but I mean, my question is, how do you know you're not doing it? And in fact, a number of the...
Look at the weight of the evidence. I mean, I think that when you look at all of the data that I've compiled, weaknesses notwithstanding, you end up with quite a lot of conservative wrong beliefs in modern politics today. And the reason this is important to my argument is that I'm then saying that let's link that back to conservative psychology, and isn't this an interesting correlation that we've got here? And the precise mechanism by which we link conservative psychology to conservatives believing a mass of wrong beliefs is actually still uncertain, because there's a lot of different mechanisms in the book. There's motivated reasoning, which is, this emotion-driven reasoning.
Common to all people to some extent.
Right. There's also selective exposure, which is selecting yourself into an information stream like Fox. And I present evidence suggesting that an authoritarian personality may do this more.
And we should say there is, well, you tell me, there is although there's certainly such a thing as a left-wing authoritarian, there is a correlation between the personality dimension known as authoritarianism and conservatism?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a big one. You would have a left-wing authoritarian, in my view, in a left totalitarian country, supporting Stalin, let's say. I mean, I think that's where you're going to see left authoritarian. Now, there might be some authoritarian personalities mixed into the left, too, today, but generally authoritarianism is thought to be a big push rightward.
Right. So, okay. But I would still say, let me hit you with one more example of the difficulty of kind of choosing the examples. And this comes from a study that I think was done by Drew Weston. I think you took it out of his book. And that raises another issue, which is that a number of these studies are done by people who are on the left, right?
Oh, well, almost all of them by definition, because it's academia. I mean, academia is overwhelmingly liberal. So, yeah.
Okay, well, this will be, you are throwing down the gauntlet to conservative social scientists, and there are some come back with their studies. But, okay, here's a little thing that he does. What he wants to do is see, give conservatives a chance to spot hypocrisy in a conservative, George Bush in this case, and in a liberal, John Kerry, and then give liberals the same opportunity, okay, and see who is more resistant to seeing the hypocrisy in their own guy. Now, but here are the examples, and these strike me as not quite the same. You've got George Bush at one point said something very flattering about Ken Lay, of course, who ran Enron. Mm-hmm. And then he says, when I'm president, I plan to run the government like a CEO runs a country. Ken Lay and Enron are a model of how I'll do that. Then after the Enron scandal, it says Mr. Bush now avoids any mention of Ken Lay and is critical of Enron when asked. Now that's the hypocrisy that we're waiting that Weston wants conservatives and then liberals to respond to.
And I believe, by the way, that in this study he made these up a little bit. They were close to life, but they weren't actually real life.
Okay, but here's my problem. Yeah. With John Kerry, you've got him during the campaign saying that he will consider raising the retirement age and mean test benefits on Social Security. Mm-hmm. And then the contradiction is supposed to be this year on Meet the Press. Kerry pledged that he will never tax or cut benefits to seniors or raise the eligibility age for Social Security. Well, usually those are different. I mean, in other words, if I say I'm going to use this guy as a role model and then he gets busted and put in prison, it's totally reasonable to change my mind and say he's no longer a model. That's not hypocrisy. Whereas if I say I'm going to do X and then I get into office or whatever, and I say I would never do X, and there's no obviously intervening variable that would explain it, I think it's right of conservatives to go, John Kerry is a bigger hypocrite here than George Bush in this example.
I guess I don't necessarily really disagree with you.
Well,
I mean, it is hard to design these studies and I talked to the researchers about that, to really, really control for all the confounds in order to detect differential bias between left and right. I mean, I wouldn't definitely build my case on any one of the studies. You know, I would build my case on the totality of evidence, and it is conceivable. It's one of the good counter arguments that there's all these cases of outrageous liberal bias out there that nobody's bothered to study. Conceivable. But I don't really think that that's what it is, because I think that liberal academia is liberal, and it is inclined to always try to test its own biases as well as conservative biases. And we are getting studies that capture liberal biases. But they look different. You know, they look really different. And so I talk about some of those in the book, and they usually have to do with, equality, race, things like that, areas that are in the liberal sweet spot because they're egalitarians. And nobody's denying that liberals have biases. But, in terms of ultimately coming out right, liberals do have this deep affinity with the scientific community, and you can show that in any number of ways. And if you trust in science, that does give liberals an advantage.
Okay. Now, the one possibility, and one you discuss, would be that, in different times, in different eras, there is maybe more extremism on the left or on the right, or for whatever reason, more resistance to science on the left or on the right. And it could be that we're just in one of those now. Okay, like for example, right now, religious fundamentalists are a bigger part of the Republican constituency, and there's the creationism, evolutionism thing, or whatever. And you acknowledge there have been times in the past when there was real resistance among liberals, and I lived through one of them because I wrote a book called The Moral Animal in 1994, which was one of the first books about evolutionary psychology, and it asserted that men and women, there's just no way you would expect natural selection to build two sexes with identical minds, and in fact, there are some predictions you can make and test about what the differences would be. There was a tremendous amount of resistance on the left to that, and much less on the right.
Well, because it is in the egalitarian sweet spot, right?
Well, okay, but that doesn't make it any less of denial.
No, it doesn't. But do you think that the same denial exists today?
Not nearly as much.
But isn't that? I think that's the point, right? And do you think that fundamentalist evolution deniers are going to go away? I mean, they've been around for 100 years, and they don't just deny evolution. They deny, the fossil record. They deny the age of the Earth. They deny radiocarbon dating. They deny, I mean, all I'm saying, I'm not saying the left is never wrong. I'm saying these are different beasts when it comes to bias. I think that's the claim. And so if you want the left to be wrong, what this theory says is it's really going to work well if you have an issue related to race and you prime those emotions, but it turns out the facts are wrong. Or you have an issue related to sex differences and you prime the emotions, but it turns out the facts are wrong. That is, there's just no doubt that you push those buttons and you get liberals real emotional, and you will have them crusading and campaigning, and it's great that we're coming to this understanding.
I'm just curious about the status of one particular thing, and I guess this is a case where the evidence is still kind of out, but endocrine disruptors. I don't think you get into this in the book, but isn't this... Yeah.
I don't know the science well enough on that issue, but okay, let's go ahead.
Well, it's complicated. I'm just wondering if... I ran into this about 10 years ago where there were people making really big deal about some things happening to frogs, and then I looked into it, and it was a lot more complicated. We were a long way from being able to infer that the stuff was caused by endocrine disruptors. And I just bring it up because it's a case on the left, and I was wondering whether there's been movement. But
well, there's a lot of these on the left. I mean, essentially, what you've got is an environmental issue with a claim about low doses, right? I mean, that's what low dose nuclear radiation would be, and those are all in the liberal area of a big corporation did it, allegedly. So we're inclined to believe a bad thing about them. and it's having some kind of harm either to children or to people who are innocent or to the environment, and this activates the care motive. So, yeah, if the facts are wrong in this area, there's definitely going to be a liberal weakness. But I don't know the facts on endocrine disruptors well enough to actually make a stand on it.
So you could say, I mean, notwithstanding your view that on balance, liberals are better at getting in sync with scientific truth, there are specific areas where even you would say you should maybe be a little suspicious of liberal claims, right? So if it's like little guy, if the claim is about common person getting victimized or oppressed by big, powerful entity,
right?
That's where liberals are.
Fracking is really great for this, right? And I think that the environmental movement is really, really going emotionally off the rails a bit.
Yeah, you look into that in the book. So you're like not anti-fracking, it sounds like.
No, I mean, because I care about global warming. I mean, and it seems to be that natural gas is a lot less bad than coal. So first of all, I'm inclined to think that natural gas is a good thing on balance, and that nuclear is a good thing on balance, because I care so much about global warming. But then, to me, I'm just bothered by the repeated attempt on the environmental left to make this claim that essentially, goes against physics, which is that, fracking occurs way, way, way below the surface. You drill down, and then you drill horizontal. And then fracking occurs in the horizontal shaft, right? And so sometimes you're as much as a mile down. And the claim is that this pollutes water supplies, but in order for that to be true, whatever you're doing has got to go vertical again. And well, how does that happen? Water doesn't go uphill, as one of the scientists explained to me when I was reporting on this. So you need pressure. You need water and chemicals to be traveling at pressure. How often does that happen? Well, it's pretty unlikely. Anyway, you unpack it, and it doesn't look like this is the real risk. There might be real risks. There are cases of contamination, but it doesn't seem to be through this mechanism. So why did the left decide that fracking was the new bad guy? And there, I think you look at liberal moral psychology of the sort that Jonathan Haidt describes, and you say, aha, because it's pushing those buttons, because it's emotional, and it's an emotional and liberal way.
Protecting the vulnerable.
And the big companies doing it, you know. You got drilling. Fracking really became emotional because Halliburton was involved, and that is sort of, to the left, it's the epitome of the big company that we don't trust, that does ill. So it's ripe for bias.
Yeah, the Dick Cheney Association doesn't help there.
The Cheney-Halliburton Association is really, I think, when the left got emotional about fracking because there was the alleged Halliburton loophole in an energy bill that Cheney had slipped in. And so anyway, once you got that, then you've got the whole narrative for the left.
It turns out, as I read your account of this in the book, there's nothing inherent in fracking that's bad. There are mistakes you can make when you frack, but they're kind of like surface-level mistakes, things you do wrong on the ground that you don't have to do wrong. Right.
That's where clearly the contamination is coming from in almost all cases. There may even be a few of these other cases, but but the science is not clear on that, and it doesn't look like fracking is the bad guy. It looks like drilling is the bad guy. Who would have thought, the drilling at the surface? Because of course that's where it is, and of course if you're cutting corners and you're doing it fast and don't have all the knowledge of the geology, etc., this is where the contamination occurs, and it's much more likely, and you don't have to have water travel vertically, to do that. So
where is the left right now on its adjustment to the truth about fracking?
Well, I would argue that that's in the process of occurring. I mean, and so I'm the left, right? And I wrote an article in Scientific American explaining this. And the reason I did that was because I'm a science reporter, and I saw Gasland, right? And I, as much of the left did, was inclined to believe all these false things about fracking. But I needed to know how it works. I needed to know what is the process by which this pollution occurs. And so you start interviewing. And when you do that, I'm sorry, what you find is that talking to the scientists, they think clearly that, the surface level issues are where the contamination occurred. The at-depth issues, which are actually the fracking process, are not. And so what do? You write the story that way, and so now I'm criticizing the left, but I'm saying that's the natural process that occurs within the scientific community, and yes, within the left science journalist and left journalist community. And we criticize each other. We're disloyal. Nothing is sacred. That's part of who we are. I mean, frankly, part of it's driven by us wanting attention. Hey, over here, I'm different. I'm willing to criticize my own. That's the left. It's very bad for mass politics. It's much better for getting at the truth. And that's the argument.
And that's another dimension of personality or
whatever,
or moral structure that is itself correlated with ideology that you implicate here in your argument. I mean, I think John Haidt talks about the conservative emphasis on loyalty to group and authority. Does he?
Yes.
Some of those.
Yes.
But you're saying that is part of it too. The reluctance to depart from a consensus in your group is greater on the conservative side. Your argument.
Right, and actually, again, I was just on TV with Haidt on MSNBC, and he was willing to take that point and say that that's why conservatives will circle the wagons around a shared belief. And again, it's not like they're all tribal, liberals aren't. I mean, it's just that they're somewhat more tribal. More inclined here, we're talking about, seeing a strong distinction between your in-group and your out-group. Right? Yeah. And loyalty, I mean, if you're in the in-group with the conservatives, then it must feel great. I mean, to have these allies that you can really trust and really count on. I mean, I would want to be in a foxhole with conservatives, not liberals.
No, there's and I guess this stereotype goes way back. There's the old Will Rogers joke, I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat, right? And that's like what? That's like 80 years ago or something. So,
or just Occupy doesn't want to support Obama. I mean, just compare Occupy and the Tea Party and look at the styles of these two movements, and I think you see conservative liberal psychology right there.
Yeah, I mean, there was some bailing on Bush by the end of the 8 years among conservatives. These are all questions of degree and arguable, but so how? Knowing that you're a human and subject to motivated reasoning or just bias in the way you
yes. No, I'm the only one that's exempt.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, why should we trust? Why should we trust a book? Why should we trust a book written by a human being? Which your book is an example.
That's an awesome question. Why should we trust a book written by a human? We probably shouldn't.
But it's a kind of a serious question. It gets back to the fact that a lot of these studies are done by liberals, and there are really inherent difficulties in setting up the studies right. It would the subtlest of biases on the part of the researcher could lead the experiment itself to be loaded.
For some of the motivated reasoning studies. I mean, no, I don't think that I would say that for the big, thousands of people personality difference studies. I think there, you really are getting big differences across large populations. I think that the things you've problematized are largely these, is the left a little more biased than the right when we push their emotional buttons and give them some information? And we try to do a controlled experiment on that. And as someone who has now run one of these experiments, yes, I'm aware of how hard it is to run these experiments. I think that, more of this is going to be done. I think there's going to be progress here. I've been talking to researchers doing it. They want to kind of try to do a meta-analysis of all these and figure out how to do it, so that you kind of control for everything and figure out how big Anyway, it's going to go that way. This is knowledge advances. The question is, why trust me? It wouldn't help to say because I'm a liberal, right?
It wouldn't help with all circles.
I know. So all I can say is that I think that I've characterized the uncertainty, which is the most important part, accurately. In other words, I think that I am able to describe research with the caveats included, and I think that I do, and I think that scientists reading it are giving me the thumbs up for that. So in other words, that means that I'm able to, I hope, again, I question myself too, but I'm able to try to adjust my beliefs to the weight of the evidence. And I'm waiting for new evidence, and that's really the best that you can do. Beyond that, I can't defend myself except to say that I have considered the doubt, I've considered the weakness of the argument, and I don't see how you get around, at the end of the day, these big liberal-conservative differences, and they're going to be playing themselves out in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I will say in your defense, I saw that MSNBC thing, and John Haidt, who is, you're right, describing himself as a conservative. I mean, as a centrist, some people accuse him of actually having gone a little further right than that. I
don't think he's, yeah.
But he knows the literature, and he said you didn't cherry pick. You know, it was an honest job. That's true. So, in terms of issues, though, let me make sure we got the big ones. I mean, you would say on the right, the big cases of denial are like evolution, climate science, anything else right now?
Well, I do try in the book to not just talk about science. So I say believing that President Obama is a Muslim from Kenya and a socialist is, to me, the same process of biased reasoning as believing that global warming is a hoax made up by liberal scientists. So, one science, one isn't, but emotionally, in terms of the brain, it's kind of the same process.
In a way, although the Obama thing is in some sense crazy, right? I mean, climate science is sufficiently complicated, I think, that if you kind of have to take it on authority in a certain sense, right? I mean, I can't say I've gone through and looked at all the computer models. I have been able to interrogate some actual scientists, and I've been satisfied with the responses, but the average person can't. And here, just to go off a little tangent very briefly that I think we're on the same page on, this is where I think people like Richard Dawkins have done damage that actually goes beyond evolution. I think they've gotten a number of people on the right to define science broadly as the enemy by being so gratuitously, aggressive, belligerent about religion.
You and I probably agree about that. Although, interestingly, the new data on the right in science shows that distrust began around 75, which is, well before the new atheism. And that
it was actually, I mean, The Selfish Gene was published in 1976, but he wasn't on that crusade then. You're right. It brings up another question. I mean, the extremist suspicion of Obama himself, the question of, that we kind of touched on, but, in different ages, are the extremists concentrated more on the left of it? You bring up the era of the Weathermen and the Black Panthers, and I'm sure if you went back, they were saying crazy stuff. They had crazy conspiracy theories. And I wonder if for that category of belief, that more vacillates from left to right over time.
Well, so unfortunately, these people are not well studied, based upon the research I've seen. Nor are Soviet communists well studied, or the Russian revolutionaries well studied, or the French revolutionaries well studied. I mean, so it's hard to say. I can tell you one theory that makes a lot of sense to me is the idea, that while authoritarianism definitely on average tilts people right, you can get left or ambiguous authoritarians just not as often. And in militant movements, the rhetoric of militant movements on either side, in terms of it's seeing the world in black and white, and frankly talking about being strong against the weak and things like that, I mean, that's the kind of language that appeals emotionally to an authoritarian, so I don't see why you can't get some mixed in, Because again, psychological needs don't have intellectual content to them. I mean, that's one of the key distinctions that a lot of people miss. So an authoritarian in the U.S. can be a Christian fundamentalist. Okay, in Saudi Arabia, they can be a Muslim fundamentalist, and under Stalin, they can be supporter of the regime, right? I mean, and all of those belief systems can be giving certainty and security. So it's about where you find what the ideology that matches your psychological needs.
Okay. Yeah. Now, near the end of the book, you have a little prescription that, if this doesn't get you into trouble with the right, I don't know what will. I mean... Okay,
well, I'm already in trouble.
I was going to say, I mean, you didn't need a lot of help, but here's... and I think you mean this as a diplomatic overture, but I can imagine how the right is going to read it. I mean, you start out saying, look, both the left and the right have their kind of natural psychological strengths. And of course, again, we're just talking about averages anyway. There will be all kinds on both sides. But, the liberals are better at getting at the truth in complex, nuanced situations, as are their psychological brethren, scientists. Conservatives are clearly better being decisive, sticking to a course, being unwavering. So then you say, the part of this truce you're recommending between left and right would be to require liberals to recognize that conservatives must play a critically important role in a variety of leadership positions in making sure that choices get made. But then you say in italics, provided that they, meaning the conservatives, heed liberals and lead in a reality-based fashion. Now, to a conservative, I would imagine that sounds like you can play quarterback so long as I'm the coach and I call the plays.
You can play coach as long as you field a team of scientists.
Right.
I mean,
Right, but I will be the arbiter of whether you do a good job of choosing them, and I will be the arbiter of, right? I mean, you're saying liberals should be the ultimate arbiters of policy itself.
No, well, I would say more of reality than policy.
But liberals are in touch with reality.
Well, that is the argument of the book. The argument of the book is essentially that Stephen Colbert's, the opening quote, reality as a well-known liberal bias, is the truth about the world, and it's true for psychological reasons. So, I don't know. I mean, conservatives are going to be upset. But I think that there is a way of conservative thinking that would go like this. It would be like, we support the traditions of society, the tradition of having a strong military, the tradition of having a thriving business community, and the tradition of having great universities. And you know what? It's always been that way, and it probably always will be, that the liberals are great in the universities, and the conservatives are great in business and great in the military. That's who we are. That's humanity. That's our heritage. And it's fine. And these are all strengths that we should recognize. So we'll use the university people the way they ought to be used. And we'll use the business people that... I think that's a conservative argument. And I think that there was a kind of conservative that used to exist in the United States for whom that was a great argument. And the problem is that we've awakened an authoritarian kind of conservatism that views everything in black and white and doesn't think that way anymore.
So to summarize your argument, Chris Mooney should be philosopher king.
No. No, but the strengths of the scientific community should be recognized for what they are and should be taken real seriously, and much more seriously than they are now on the right.
Okay. You're not, I'm willing to be philosopher king if you're not.
Okay, well, I would follow your leadership.
Would you?
I think it would be reality-based.
Well, that would not be very liberal of you to follow leadership at all, would it?
But liberals don't like to follow authority either, and I tell them in the book, I'm like, you guys have got to follow authority more. I mean, you guys have got to be more loyal to your team and your tribe, and you need to stop kicking Obama in the shins all the time. I mean, that's politically ineffective.
But you can't have it both ways, right? I mean, that is the source of their contact with the truth that you laud, right, is the fact that they refuse to be team. That they're all on their own little mission.
Right, and I'm asking them to draw a distinction between their style in politics and their substance, basically. In other words, keep thinking like a liberal, but realize that when you start acting like in politics, then being like a liberal is going to get you balkanized environmental movement with all these different organizations claiming to do the same thing, or balkanized secular and free thought movement with all these different organizations, and that's not effective.
Okay. Anything else about the book you want to say that we haven't touched on?
No, we've gone into great depth, and I think we have covered it.
Covered a lot. It's a fascinating book, and if this won't start an argument at a cocktail party, that means you're going to entirely liberal cocktail parties. Even there, I think it would. It will start. It would probably spark the occasional debate. But fascinating book. Good luck with it.
Thanks, Bob.
Congratulations on being denounced by Jonah Goldberg.
Oh, yes, that was good.
Okay. All right. Take care, Chris.
You too.